The lights inside a luxury hotel are never truly off. Even late at night, when the lobby is empty and the last elevator hum fades into silence, something still glows. Chandeliers remain dimly lit. Hallway lamps cast long, soft shadows across thick carpets designed to swallow sound. Everything feels calm, controlled, expensive, almost comforting. And for more than a century, that quiet atmosphere has carried one name again and again: Hilton. It's a name most of us recognize instantly, a name that feels safe, reliable, predictable. You know what you're getting when you see it glowing on the side of a building. Clean rooms, polished surface, a sense that someone, somewhere, has already handled all the chaos for you. But families don't work the same way hotels do. Behind every carefully managed brand is a group of real people, moving through real lives, carrying ambitions, resentments, expectations, and secrets that never appear on balance sheets or brass nameplates. And the Hilton family empire, for all its smooth surfaces, was built slowly, quietly, and often uncomfortably, over decades of pressure and control. Tonight, we're not here to tear anything down. There's no shouting, no scandal chasing, no shocking twists meant to jolt you awake. Instead, this is a slow walk through long hallways of history, a gentle unfolding of how immense wealth shapes families, how power changes relationships, and how silence often becomes the most valuable asset of all. As you listen, you might picture those empty hotel corridors again, the way everything looks perfect from a distance, the way the quiet feels intentional, and how, if you linger long enough, you start to notice what's missing. This story stretches across generations. It begins with one man, driven and disciplined, convinced that order and success could be built the same way everywhere, if only the rules were followed closely enough. His vision would create one of the most recognizable hospitality empires in the world. It would also leave behind complicated relationships, emotional distance, and a family that often learned to perform unity rather than live it. So settle in, adjust the pillow, let the room grow a little quieter around you. You don't need to remember every detail or hold on to every name. This is the kind of story that can simply wash over you, steady and unhurried, the way familiar background sounds fade as sleep draws closer. Here on Boring Owl, we tell these stories slowly, carefully, without raising our voice. Stories meant to accompany long nights, dim rooms, and wandering thoughts. You can listen closely, or you can let it drift. Either way, the story will keep going. And when you're ready, we'll begin at the very start, with the man behind the name and the quiet choices that shaped everything that came after. Before the Hilton name ever glowed above city streets or shimmered in glossy travel magazines, it belonged to a man who believed deeply in order. Not the gentle kind of order that comforts you, but the rigid kind that demands obedience. Conrad Hilton did not stumble. The lights inside a luxury hotel are never truly off. Even late at night, when the lobby is empty and the last elevator hum fades into silence, something still glows. Chandeliers remain dimly lit. Hallway lamps cast long, soft shadows across thick carpets designed to swallow sound. Everything feels calm, controlled, expensive, almost comforting. And for more than a century, that quiet atmosphere has carried one name again and again: Hilton. It's a name most of us recognize instantly, A name that feels safe, reliable, predictable. You know what you're getting when you see it glowing on the side of a building. Clean rooms, polished surface, a sense that someone, somewhere, has already handled all the chaos for you. But families don't work the same way hotels do. Behind every carefully managed brand is a group of real people, moving through real lives, carrying ambitions, resentments, expectations, and secrets that never appear on balance sheets or brass nameplates. And the Hilton family empire, for all its smooth surfaces, was built slowly, quietly, and often uncomfortably, over decades of pressure and control. Tonight, we're not here to tear anything down. There's no shouting, no scandal chasing, no shocking twists meant to jolt you awake. Instead, this is a slow walk through long hallways of history, a gentle unfolding of how immense wealth shapes families, how power changes relationships, and how silence often becomes the most valuable asset of all. As you listen, you might picture those empty hotel corridors again, the way everything looks perfect from a distance, the way the quiet feels intentional, and how, if you linger long enough, you start to notice what's missing. This story stretches across generations. It begins with one man, driven and disciplined, convinced that order and success could be built the same way everywhere, if only the rules were followed closely enough. His vision would create one of the most recognizable hospitality empires in the world. It would also leave behind complicated relationships, emotional distance, and a family that often learned to perform unity rather than live it. So settle in, adjust the pillow, let the room grow a little quieter around you. You don't need to remember every detail or hold on to every name. This is the kind of story that can simply wash over you, steady and unhurried, the way familiar background sounds fade as sleep draws closer. Here on Boring Owl, we tell these stories slowly, carefully, without raising our voice. Stories meant to accompany long nights, dim rooms, and wandering thoughts. You can listen closely, or you can let it drift. Either way, the story will keep going. And when you're ready, we'll begin at the very start, with the man behind the name and the quiet choices that shaped everything that came after. Before the Hilton name ever glowed above city streets or shimmered in glossy travel magazines, it belonged to a man who believed deeply in order. Not the gentle kind of order that comforts you, but the rigid kind that demands obedience. Conrad Hilton did not stumble into wealth. He chased it patiently, deliberately, and with a seriousness that rarely left room for softness. He was born in New Mexico territory, long before it was polished or predictable. His father ran a small general store, the kind of place where everything had its place and credit was remembered longer than kindness. From an early age, Conrad learned that survival depended on structure. You worked, you kept records, you didn't waste time wondering how things felt. Feelings didn't balance books. As a young man, Conrad tried several paths before hotels ever entered his mind. He studied engineering. He served in the army during World War I. He observed how systems worked, how men followed rules, and how authority flowed downward without question. Those experiences shaped him more than any business class ever could. When he returned home, he wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for control. His first hotel purchase in 1919 was almost accidental. The Mobley Hotel in Cisco, Texas wasn't glamorous. It was loud, crowded, and filled with oil workers sleeping in shifts. Beds were rented by the hour. Privacy was non-existent.
But Conrad saw something important. He saw efficiency. He saw constant demand. And most of all, he saw that people would accept discomfort if it was organized properly. That idea stayed with him. Conrad believed hospitality wasn't warmth, it was reliability. Guests didn't need affection, they needed reliability. Clean sheets, clear rules, a sense that someone competent was in charge. This belief would become the backbone of the Hilton empire, and it would also quietly shape how Conrad treated his closest people. As his business grew, so did his expectations. He expected precision, loyalty, silence when decisions were made. He admired discipline and distrusted weakness. In his world, hesitation looked like failure, emotion looked like inefficiency, and chaos of any kind was something to be eliminated quickly. Those values worked remarkably well in business. By the 1920s and 1930s, Hilton hotels were expanding rapidly.
Family life was structured, but not necessarily warm. Love was assumed, not expressed. Expectations were clear, but approval was rare. Conrad believed providing financially was the highest form of care. Emotional presence, in his view, was optional. His children would grow up surrounded by wealth, but not always by closeness. Conrad married multiple times, and each relationship reflected his personality more than partnership. His marriages were shaped by hierarchy. He led. Others adjusted. When conflict arose, it wasn't discussed gently. It was endured or ignored or eventually abandoned. Stability mattered more than harmony. To the outside world, Conrad Hilton was a symbol of American success, a self-made man, a disciplined entrepreneur, someone who turned vision into concrete and steel. Newspapers praised his determination. Business circles admired his restraint. There was little curiosity about what it cost to maintain that level of control. Inside the family, the atmosphere was quieter. Rules existed even when they weren't spoken. Children learned early when to speak and when to remain invisible. Praise was rare, and when it came, it was subtle. Disapproval, on the other hand, didn't need words. It lived in silence, in distance, in the feeling of never quite measuring up. Conrad believed legacy was built through endurance. He wanted his name to last. He wanted his hotels to outlive him, and he wanted his family to reflect the same discipline he demanded of himself. What he didn't fully consider was how pressure accumulates when there's no release. As the Hilton name expanded internationally, Conrad's focus narrowed. The business came first, always. Decisions were made from the top, and dissent was unwelcome. This worked in boardrooms. It worked in contracts. It worked in negotiations with banks and investors. It did not always work in living rooms. Children raised under that kind of authority learned to perform rather than express. They learned what's expected, not what's felt. And over time, they internalized the idea that approval is something earned through obedience, not connection. Conrad Hilton rarely questioned his approach. To him, results justified methods. The hotels were full, the brand was strong, the balance sheets were clean. If something felt cold, that was simply the price of efficiency. And yet, cracks were forming quietly. Wealth insulated the family from public scrutiny, but it couldn't erase emotional distance. Conversations stayed practical, affection remained formal. The Hilton household functioned more like an institution than a refuge, structured, predictable, and strangely lonely. As Conrad aged, his grip tightened rather than softened. He believed control slipping was the greatest danger of all. He watched his children carefully, measuring them against his own standards, standards shaped by hardship they had never known. That difference created tension he rarely acknowledged. To
To Conrad, struggle built character. To his children, expectations felt heavy and unmoving. They inherited privilege without understanding and responsibility without guidance. And while the Hilton name opened every door, it also closed off space for error. By the time the Hilton empire became a global symbol of luxury, the emotional foundation beneath it was already strained. The man behind the name had built something immense, something lasting, but he had also built it in his own image, orderly, disciplined, impressive, and emotionally distant. This is where the story truly begins, not in ballrooms or penthouses, but in the quiet space between success and satisfaction. Because the choices Conrad Hilton made while building his empire didn't stay confined to business. They flowed directly into the lives of his family, shaping how love was given, how loyalty was tested, and how silence became the most reliable form of communication. And as the empire continued to grow, those early patterns would only deepen, carrying forward into the next generation, where wealth could no longer hide the cost of perfection. As the Hilton name spread across cities and borders, the hotels themselves began to feel less like individual buildings and more like extensions of one man's philosophy. Each new property was another controlled environment, carefully designed to behave exactly as Conrad Hilton expected. The carpets, the lighting, the service, even the tone of voices at the front desk were shaped by an invisible rulebook that valued consistency above all else. To guests, this was reassuring. To Conrad, it was essential. He believed unpredictability was the enemy of success. A hotel, in his mind, was not a place for personality. It was a machine, and machines worked best when every part knew its role and stayed quiet while doing it. That idea allowed the Hilton brand to expand rapidly without losing its identity. It also created an internal culture where deviation was treated as failure.
Behind the scenes, staff learned quickly what was acceptable. Smiles were expected, but not individuality. Efficiency mattered more than warmth. Problems were handled discreetly, away from public view. A guest should never feel tension, even if the building was full, the staff exhausted, and management under pressure. This same philosophy quietly shaped family life. As Conrad's children grew older, the empire grew heavier. There was always another hotel to inspect, another deal to oversee, another crisis to manage. Time at home became structured and limited. Conversations revolved around logistics, travel schedules, and expectations. Emotional check-ins rarely made the agenda. Wealth provided comfort, but it also created distance. The family lived well, but not loosely. There was a sense that everything, even relaxation, had to be earned. Leisure without purpose felt wasteful. Silence, on the other hand, was efficient. Conrad expected loyalty, not discussion. When decisions were made, they were final. Questioning them was seen as disrespect rather than curiosity. His children learned to read the room carefully, to anticipate moods, to adjust their behavior accordingly. This skill would serve them well in public life, but it came at a cost. In the hotels, control produced profits. In the family, it produced restraint. The Hilton brand thrived on the idea that luxury could be standardized, that a guest in one city should feel the same calm confidence as a guest in another. This required discipline at every level. Managers followed scripts. Employees followed manuals. Creativity was secondary to compliance. At home, a similar pattern emerged. The family image mattered. Appearances were managed carefully. Private struggles were kept private. There was an unspoken understanding that personal difficulties should never interfere with the brand's stability. As the business expanded internationally, Conrad's attention became even more focused on legacy. He wasn't just building hotels anymore. He was building permanence. He wanted the Hilton name to survive economic downturns, wars, cultural shifts. To do that, he believed the family had to remain united, disciplined, and quiet. But unity built on silence is fragile.
The children were raised in an environment where success was assumed, but affection was conditional. Praise came in the form of opportunity, not words. Disapproval came through distance. This taught them to associate worth with performance, not presence. Publicly, the Hilton family appeared strong and composed. Privately, communication often felt formal. Feelings were implied, not expressed. Conflict was avoided rather than resolved. This worked for a time. The family functioned smoothly, much like the hotels themselves. Yet pressure has a way of accumulating. As years passed, the demands of the empire intensified. The business required constant vigilance. Competition increased. The hospitality industry evolved. Conrad responded the only way he knew, by tightening control. Standards became stricter. Expectations rose. Flexibility decreased. Inside the family, this created tension that rarely surfaced openly. Children who wanted independence struggled to find it without feeling disloyal. Personal choices felt like business decisions. Marriages, careers, and lifestyles were quietly evaluated against how they reflected on the Hilton name. Luxury, for all its comfort, can feel suffocating when it leaves no room to fail. The empire's growth brought prestige, but it also brought isolation. The family moved in elite circles, surrounded by people who admired the brand more than the individuals behind it. Genuine relationships became harder to distinguish from strategic ones. Trust was complicated by wealth. Conrad remained convinced that discipline was the highest form of care. If the family stayed organized and successful, everything else would sort itself out. Emotional discomfort was seen as temporary. Results were permanent. But the cracks were no longer invisible. As the next generation approached adulthood, questions of control and autonomy became unavoidable. Who would inherit responsibility? Who would be trusted? And what would happen to those who didn't fit neatly into the structure Conrad had built? The Hilton Empire was no longer just a business. It was a system that shaped identities. Children raised within it learned to manage impressions, to maintain composure, to hide uncertainty behind confidence. These skills would later make them recognizable figures. They would also make vulnerability feel dangerous. By the time Conrad began to consider succession, the family dynamic had already been shaped by decades of pressure. Love had become implicit, approval had become rare, and silence had become a form of communication more powerful than words. This chapter of the story isn't about collapse, not yet. It's about accumulation. The slow gathering of unspoken tension, the way success can quietly harden into expectation, the way comfort can coexist with loneliness. Because as the Hilton Empire continued to expand outward, something inside it was tightening. And the decisions made during this period would echo forward, influencing not just who controlled the business, but how the family understood loyalty, worth, and belonging. What began as a system for managing hotels had become a system for managing people. And soon, that system would be tested in ways Conrad Hilton never fully anticipated.
By the time Conrad Hilton's empire had become a permanent fixture of American business, marriage inside the Hilton world had taken on a particular shape. From the outside, it looked traditional, respectable, even enviable. Inside, it followed the same rules that governed the hotels. Hierarchy first, emotion second, silence whenever possible. Conrad married young, and more than once, but none of his relationships ever truly escaped the shadow of his ambition. He did not see marriage as a partnership built on negotiation. He saw it as a structure. Roles were assumed, responsibilities were assigned, and as with everything else in his life, control rested firmly at the top. His wives entered a world where the Hilton name mattered more than individual comfort. Public appearances were important. Stability was essential. Personal dissatisfaction, on the other hand, was something to be endured quietly. Conrad believed deeply that a man's duty was to provide, and if that duty was fulfilled, emotional harmony would eventually follow. It rarely did. The early marriages were marked by long absences and emotional distance. Conrad traveled constantly, overseeing properties, negotiating deals, expanding the empire. Home became a place he passed through rather than lived in. When he was present, he brought the same seriousness he carried into boardrooms. Conversations were purposeful, time was managed, there was little room for softness or uncertainty. His wives learned quickly that pushing back was ineffective. Disagreement was interpreted as disruption. Requests for emotional closeness were often met with practicality instead of reassurance. In Conrad's worldview, stability came from discipline, not dialogue. This created a quiet imbalance. Power flowed in one direction, decisions were made unilaterally, adaptation was expected from everyone else. Over time, this eroded intimacy, replacing it with formality. Marriages functioned, but they did not necessarily breathe. Divorce, when it came, was handled discreetly. There were no public scandals, no dramatic confrontations played out in headlines. Separation was treated like a business restructuring, necessary, unfortunate, private. The Hilton name remained intact even as personal relationships dissolved behind closed doors. For the children watching all of this unfold, marriage became associated with endurance rather than connection. They absorbed the lesson that appearances mattered more than emotional truth, that conflict should be hidden, that stability, even if hollow, was preferable to honesty that might disrupt the image. Control did not stop at the marital relationship. It extended into parenting. Conrad believed children needed direction, not discussion. Expectations were set early. Discipline was firm. Affection was implied rather than demonstrated. He assumed that providing opportunity was equivalent to providing love. Emotional presence was secondary to preparation for responsibility. This approach created children who were outwardly composed and inwardly uncertain. They learned to behave correctly in public, to speak carefully, to avoid drawing negative attention. But they also learned that emotional needs were inconvenient, that vulnerability disrupted order. Silence became a survival skill. Inside the Hilton household, difficult conversations were often postponed indefinitely. Tension lingered in rooms without being named. Resentment had no outlet, so it settled quietly. This did not produce chaos, it produced compliance. And compliance, at least on the surface, looked like harmony. As the children grew older, they began to understand that their value was tied closely to how well they represented the family. Personal choices were never entirely personal. Careers, relationships, and lifestyles were all measured against how they reflected on the Hilton name. Romantic relationships, in particular, became complicated. Love was never just love. It came with scrutiny. Partners were evaluated, not just emotionally, but socially and strategically. Approval was subtle, disapproval even more so, and the absence of approval was often louder than any direct criticism. For Conrad, this was simply responsible stewardship. He believed that families of influence had obligations, that personal desire should never outweigh legacy. He had built something enduring, and he expected those around him to protect it, even if that meant sacrificing comfort. But emotional sacrifices accumulate. Wives who felt unheard withdrew. Children who felt unseen adapted. The family learned to coexist rather than connect. Gatherings were polite. Conversations stayed on safe topics. Praise was scarce. Criticism was indirect. This environment shaped how the next generation understood relationships. Love became associated with conditions. Security felt tied to performance, and silence was often safer than honesty. Publicly, the Hilton family remained a symbol of success. Photographs showed smiling faces, elegant settings, composed confidence. Privately, many relationships felt transactional. Stable, yes. Deep, not always.
As time passed, the consequences of this emotional structure became harder to ignore. Marriages strained under unspoken expectations. Children sought validation in ways that did not always align with the family's values. The carefully managed image began to show signs of stress. Conrad, however, remained largely unmoved. To him, discomfort was not evidence of failure, it was evidence of discipline. He believed people grew stronger by enduring, not by expressing. That philosophy had built his empire. He saw no reason to abandon it now. Yet the world around him was changing. As social norms shifted and emotional openness became more acceptable, the Hilton family's internal rigidity stood in quiet contrast. Younger generations questioned rules that had never been explained. They felt the weight of expectations without fully understanding their purpose. This created a subtle generational divide. Conrad's worldview was shaped by hardship and scarcity. His children were shaped by abundance and restraint. Both experiences carried pressure, but they expressed it differently. Marriage, once seen as a stabilizing force, began to reveal its fragility within the family. Relationships built on silence struggled to adapt. The absence of open communication left little room for repair. And so, while the empire continued to project confidence and control, the personal lives behind it grew increasingly complex. Love, loyalty, and legacy pulled in different directions. The rules that had once created order now felt restrictive. This chapter of the Hilton story is not about scandal or spectacle. It's about the quiet cost of control, about how stability, when enforced too tightly, can suffocate connection, about how silence, while useful for maintaining appearances, can slowly erode the foundation it's meant to protect. Because as the Hilton family moved forward, the unresolved tensions within marriages and relationships did not disappear. They simply waited. And in the next generation, they would begin to surface in ways that could no longer be managed quietly. By the time the Hilton children reached adulthood, the empire they were born into no longer felt like something being built. It felt complete, immovable, already decided. The hotels were everywhere. The name carried weight before they ever spoke it themselves, and with that weight came a quiet understanding that their lives would never unfold entirely on their own terms. They grew up surrounded by comfort, but not freedom. Every advantage was available, yet every path felt narrow. Education was expected to be excellent. Behavior was expected to be controlled. Mistakes were tolerated only if they remained invisible. The Hilton children learned early that privilege came with surveillance. Their father was not cruel in the traditional sense. He did not rage or humiliate. Instead, he withheld. Approval was rare, praise even rarer. Expectations were communicated through silence as much as words. When disappointment arrived, it did not come loudly. It arrived as distance. This taught the children something important and unsettling. Love in the Hilton world was something you earned by not causing trouble. Each child responded differently to this environment, but all of them learned to manage themselves carefully. Emotions were moderated. Desires were filtered. Curiosity was allowed only when it aligned with usefulness. There was little space for open rebellion, and even less for vulnerability. Their home life mirrored the hotels their father built. Everything appeared polished, orderly, predictable. But underneath, the atmosphere was tightly controlled. Conversations stayed on safe ground. Personal struggles were handled privately, if at all. Family gatherings felt formal, more like meetings than moments of connection. As the children grew older, the pressure subtly shifted. Childhood expectations turned into adult responsibility. They were no longer just heirs, they were potential stewards of a global empire. Every action carried symbolic weight. Careers became particularly complicated. Some children were drawn naturally to business, eager to prove themselves worthy. Others felt trapped by expectations they never chose. Choosing a path outside the Hilton framework felt risky, almost disloyal.
Choosing to stay within it meant accepting constant comparison. Conrad measured his children against standards shaped by his own early struggles. He valued endurance, discipline, and restraint, but his children had grown up insulated from scarcity. Their challenges were different. They faced emotional pressure rather than financial hardship. This difference often went unacknowledged. As a result, misunderstandings accumulated. The children wanted recognition for navigating a world of expectations. Conrad wanted results. He believed strength came from surviving pressure, not discussing it. When his children struggled, he saw it as a test. When they succeeded, he saw it as confirmation that his methods worked.
This dynamic created a quiet competition among siblings. Not an open rivalry, but a subtle comparison that lingered beneath the surface. Who was trusted more? Who caused fewer problems? Who fit the image best? These judgments were rarely spoken, but they were deeply felt. In public, the Hilton children were composed and confident. They attended events, represented the brand, and spoke with ease. Privately, many of them wrestled with uncertainty. They questioned whether they were valued for who they were or for how well they performed. Identity became a complicated thing. The Hilton name opened doors effortlessly, but it also filled every room before they entered it. Strangers had expectations, friends had assumptions. Privacy was limited. Authenticity felt risky. For some, the pressure led to compliance. They followed the path laid out for them, hoping approval would eventually arrive. For others, it sparked quiet resistance, small acts of independence, choices that pushed gently against expectations without fully breaking away. None of it felt simple. The family rarely addressed these tensions directly. Open conversation was not part of the culture. Instead, issues were managed indirectly, through advisors, through distance, through time. This approach preserved order, but it did not resolve discomfort. As Conrad aged, his children became increasingly aware that succession loomed ahead. Who would inherit control? Who would be trusted with decision-making power? Who would be left on the periphery? These questions hovered unspoken, influencing behavior and relationships. Preparation for leadership did not come with emotional guidance. It came with observation and expectation. Children were expected to absorb lessons by watching, not by asking. Mistakes were noted quietly. Successes were acknowledged sparingly. This environment produced adults who were highly capable and deeply guarded. They knew how to navigate public life. They knew how to maintain composure, but many struggled with intimacy, trust, and self-definition. Wealth shielded them from external consequences, but it could not protect them from internal ones. Feelings of inadequacy persisted despite success. Approval remained elusive, and the line between personal desire and family obligation stayed blurred. The Hilton children carried an invisible inheritance, not just money or influence, but a way of relating to the world, a belief that love was conditional, that stability mattered more than honesty, that silence was safer than conflict. As they stepped further into adulthood, these beliefs began to shape their own relationships. Friendships, marriages, and parenting styles all reflected the environment they had been raised in. Patterns repeated, sometimes unconsciously. The empire, for all its grandeur, had created a generation skilled in presentation but uncertain in connection. And while the Hilton name continued to symbolize comfort and reliability for millions of guests, inside the family, comfort was harder to find. This chapter marks a turning point. The children were no longer just products of Conrad's world. They were becoming creators of their own. And the choices they made, shaped by years of pressure and silence, would determine whether the Hilton legacy remained purely a business success or evolved into something more human. Because as the next phase of the story unfolds, the question is no longer just about who controls the empire. It's about what kind of people that empire produces and what it quietly takes from them along the way. By the time questions of inheritance could no longer be avoided, the Hilton empire had grown too large to pass quietly from one set of hands to another.
This was no longer a simple family business. It was a global system of properties, partnerships, and expectations, all tied to a name that carried both prestige and pressure. And within the family, everyone understood that succession would not be decided by affection. It would be decided by trust, or at least Conrad's version of it. For years, succession remained an unspoken topic, not because it was irrelevant, but because it was uncomfortable. Discussing who would inherit control meant acknowledging mortality, conflict, and the possibility that some children would inevitably be chosen over others. Conrad preferred certainty. Open-ended conversations did not appeal to him. Instead, he observed. He watched how his children behaved in public, how they handled responsibility, how closely they aligned with his values. He noted who followed instructions without resistance and who seemed distracted by personal ambition. These judgments were rarely shared. Approval, when it appeared, came subtly. Disapproval often arrived as exclusion. This created an atmosphere of quiet tension. The children sensed that they were being evaluated, but the criteria were never clearly defined. Was loyalty more important than competence? Was obedience valued more than innovation? No one could say for sure, so they adapted in different ways.
Some leaned into the structure, working closely with the business, hoping proximity would signal commitment. Others kept their distance, unsure whether involvement would lead to opportunity or disappointment. And a few found themselves caught in between, neither fully embraced nor entirely dismissed. What made succession particularly complex was Conrad's belief that leadership was something proven, not discussed. He did not believe in preparing his children through reassurance. He believed in testing them through pressure. Those who endured without complaint were, in his mind, the strongest candidates. This approach worked well in business negotiations. It worked less well in family dynamics. As the years passed, subtle divisions formed. Conversations became more cautious. Siblings measured their words carefully, aware that nothing was entirely private. Decisions about careers, relationships, and lifestyle choices took on added weight as each action seemed to signal either alignment or deviation. Favoritism, whether intentional or not, became impossible to ignore. Certain children received more access, more information, more responsibility. Others were kept at arm's length. These distinctions were never explained, but they were deeply felt. Being chosen meant validation. Being overlooked meant doubt. And doubt, in a family built on silence, had nowhere to go. Outside advisors began to play a larger role during this period. Lawyers, accountants, and business partners helped structure the future of the empire. On paper, everything was orderly. Shares were allocated, trusts were established, legal language replaced emotional conversation. This process protected the business, but it further distanced the family from itself. Inheritance discussions happened in offices, not living rooms. Decisions were formalized in documents, not dialogue. The children learned about their future roles through outcomes rather than explanations. Some accepted this as inevitable, others quietly resented it. For Conrad, this was simply how serious things were handled. Emotion complicated matters, structure simplified them. He believed clarity came from rules, not reassurance. If his children felt unsettled, that was something they would have to manage privately. But inheritance is never just about money. It's about recognition, about belonging, about being seen as worthy. And when those needs go unmet, even the most generous financial arrangements can feel hollow. As control of the empire began to shift, new tensions emerged. Power dynamics within the family changed subtly. Those closer to decision-making gained influence. Those further away felt increasingly disconnected. This imbalance affected relationships. Sibling bonds, already shaped by comparison, became strained. Trust eroded quietly. Conversations stayed polite, but warmth faded. Everyone was careful, but few felt relaxed.
The Hilton name continued to thrive publicly. New hotels opened, partnerships expanded. The brand projected confidence and continuity. Guests around the world experienced the same calm predictability Conrad had envisioned decades earlier. Inside the family, predictability felt different. It felt like waiting to see who would be trusted, waiting to see who would be sidelined, waiting for approval that might never come. As Conrad aged, his presence remained dominant. He did not loosen control easily. Letting go felt dangerous. He had built the empire through vigilance, and he feared that easing his grip would invite decline. This hesitation delayed transitions that might have softened tensions. Instead of gradual change, authority lingered at the top. The children remained in a prolonged state of uncertainty, old enough to carry responsibility, but not empowered to lead fully. This uncertainty bred frustration. Some family members sought meaning outside the empire: philanthropy, personal projects, public roles that allowed them to define themselves beyond the Hilton name. These pursuits offered a sense of agency, but they also highlighted the emotional distance within the family. Others stayed close to the business, believing proximity equaled security. Yet even there, approval remained elusive. Praise was minimal, criticism indirect, expectations high. The empire, once a symbol of unity, now quietly divided the family into insiders and observers. None of this unfolded dramatically. There were no public feuds, no explosive confrontations. Everything happened slowly, politely, and with great care to preserve appearances. That restraint, while admirable on the surface, allowed resentment to deepen unchecked.
By the time formal succession plans were finalized, emotional lines had already been drawn. Some family members felt chosen, others felt tolerated, and a few felt entirely disconnected from the legacy they were born into. Conrad believed he had secured the future. The business was stable, the brand was protected, the legal framework was sound. From his perspective, the job was done. What he did not fully see was what had been lost along the way. The process of deciding who would control the empire had reinforced the very patterns that shaped the family from the beginning: silence over conversation, structure over empathy, control over connection. As the next generation stepped further into the spotlight, they carried not just wealth and responsibility, but unresolved questions about their place within the family, questions that money could not answer. And as the story moves forward, those unanswered questions would begin to surface in more public, more complicated ways. Because when legacy is inherited without understanding, it often expresses itself through tension, rebellion, and the search for identity beyond the name. As Conrad Hilton moved deeper into his later years, the empire he had built began to feel heavier, not because it was failing, but because it was no longer entirely his to carry. Age did not soften his instincts. If anything, it sharpened them. He watched the world change around him and responded the only way he knew, by tightening his grip. The hospitality industry was evolving, competition increased, new brands emerged with fresh ideas and looser cultures. Travel became more accessible, less formal. Conrad observed these shifts with skepticism. To him, change carried risk, and risk threatened everything he had spent a lifetime protecting. So he doubled down on structure. Decision-making remained centralized. Approval processes grew longer. Authority stayed firmly at the top. Even as advisors suggested adaptation, Conrad trusted his own judgment above all else. His success, after all, had come from resisting panic and maintaining discipline. He saw no reason to abandon that formula now. Inside the family, this reluctance to release control created a strange imbalance. Conrad remained the ultimate authority, yet the day-to-day realities of managing such a vast empire required delegation.
Responsibility increased, but power did not always follow. Family members found themselves accountable without autonomy. This blurred line between trust and control created frustration that was rarely spoken aloud. The children, now adults, sensed that time was running in two directions at once. On one hand, they were expected to prepare for leadership. On the other, they were still treated as if full authority needed to be earned repeatedly. Every decision felt provisional. Every success felt temporary. This prolonged transition strained relationships further. Conrad's health, while declining, did not lead to open discussions about stepping back. Vulnerability was not part of his vocabulary. He believed showing weakness invited instability. So instead of gradual handover, control remained centralized even as the burden increased. Outside the family, the empire continued to project confidence. Hotels operated smoothly, financial reports reassured investors. The Hilton name remained synonymous with reliability. Few suspected how much tension existed behind the scenes. Legal and financial structures grew more complex during this period. Trusts, foundations, and corporate arrangements were put in place to safeguard the future. These mechanisms were effective, but they also created emotional distance. Conversations about legacy happened through documents, not dialogue. Family members learned about decisions after they were finalized. Information flowed downward, rarely upward. This reinforced a long-standing pattern. Authority spoke, others adjusted. As Conrad's influence slowly began to wane due to age, his expectations did not. He continued to measure his children against ideals shaped decades earlier. He valued restraint. He valued endurance. He valued silence in the face of discomfort. But the world his children lived in was different. They faced public scrutiny. Media attention increased. Personal lives became more visible. The Hilton name attracted curiosity beyond business. Suddenly, the family was not just wealthy, it was recognizable. This shift brought new pressures. Mistakes that once could have remained private now carried reputational risk. Personal struggles became harder to hide. The carefully managed separation between public and private life began to erode. For a family trained to value discretion above all else, this was deeply unsettling. Conrad responded by reinforcing boundaries. Privacy was emphasized. Appearances were managed carefully. Any deviation from the expected image was addressed quickly and quietly. The brand had to be protected, even if that meant suppressing uncomfortable realities.
This approach maintained stability in the short term. In the long term, it increased emotional strain. Family members felt trapped between expectation and exposure. They were expected to uphold a flawless image while navigating personal challenges without support. Asking for help felt like failure. Speaking openly felt dangerous. As Conrad's health continued to decline, moments of uncertainty increased. Who would make final decisions if he could not? How would conflicts be resolved without his authority? These questions lingered without answers. Rather than addressing them directly, the family relied on existing structures. Advisors stepped in. Legal frameworks guided outcomes. Authority became more diffused, yet no less rigid. This period marked a subtle shift in the empire. Control was no longer concentrated in one man, but the culture he had created persisted. Silence remained the preferred response to tension. Order remained the highest priority. For the next generation, this created a confusing inheritance. They received responsibility without clarity, authority without trust, freedom with invisible limits. Some family members began to push back in small ways. They pursued personal interests. They tested boundaries. They sought validation outside the family structure. These actions were not loud rebellions, but quiet attempts at self-definition. Others retreated inward. They complied. They maintained appearances. They waited. The Hilton Empire, once a symbol of certainty, now existed in a state of careful maintenance. It was stable but brittle, strong but inflexible. Conrad Hilton passed, having secured his business legacy. The hotels remained, the brand endured, the legal protections held. From a business perspective, his life's work was a success. From a family perspective, the picture was more complicated. His absence created space, but also uncertainty. Without his singular authority, unresolved tensions surfaced more easily. Decisions that once would have been final now required negotiation. Relationships shaped by hierarchy struggled to adapt to collaboration. The empire entered a new phase, one without its founder, but deeply influenced by his methods. Control had shifted, but the habits of control remained. And as the story moves forward, the consequences of decades spent prioritizing structure over connection would become increasingly visible. Because when authority disappears but its shadow remains, families are left to navigate not just inheritance, but identity. The Hilton Empire survived its founder, but the question that now lingered was quieter and more personal. Could the family learn to function without the man who taught them that silence was strength? After Conrad Hilton was gone, something subtle but irreversible changed. The empire remained intact, the hotels still glowing quietly in cities around the world, but the atmosphere inside the family shifted. Authority no longer flowed from a single figure. It fractured, spread out, and in doing so, exposed parts of the family that had never been meant for public view. This was the moment when the Hilton name began to mean more than business. For decades, the family had lived behind layers of formality. Wealth insulated them. Discretion protected them. The brand spoke louder than any individual. But in the latter half of the 20th century, the world itself began to change. Media expanded. Celebrity culture grew louder. Privacy became harder to maintain even for those who valued it most. The Hilton family was no longer just wealthy, it was interesting. Attention arrived gradually at first. A mention here, a photograph there. Society pages took note of the next generation stepping into visible roles. But over time, curiosity turned into fixation. The Hilton name carried history, money, and now recognizable faces. For a family raised to believe that silence was safety, this visibility felt dangerous. Public life demanded personality. It rewarded openness, charm, and accessibility. These were not traits the Hilton children had been encouraged to develop. They had been trained to be composed, restrained, and careful. Now they were expected to be engaging. Some adapted more easily than others. A few family members discovered that attention offered something they had rarely received at home: validation. Being seen, praised, and recognized felt intoxicating. Cameras, interviews, and headlines became mirrors reflecting worth back at them.
Others recoiled from the spotlight. They found it intrusive, exposing, and unsettling. Private struggles, once carefully contained, risked becoming public knowledge. The boundary between personal life and public image grew thinner by the year. The Hilton brand, built on predictability and calm, now existed alongside personalities that were unpredictable and human. This created internal conflict. The older generation still valued restraint. They believed dignity came from distance. Fame, in their view, was a distraction, something that could cheapen the brand if mishandled. They worried that visibility would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny would reveal what had long been hidden. The younger generation lived in a different reality. Media was everywhere. Attention could not always be avoided, and in some cases it could be leveraged. Fame offered independence from the rigid structures of the family business. It allowed individuals to exist as themselves, not just as heirs. This shift unsettled the carefully maintained order. As the Hilton name appeared more frequently in headlines unrelated to hotels, the family faced a new challenge. Control was no longer solely internal. Public opinion became a factor. Narratives could form without permission. The family responded the way it always had, by managing appearances. Public relations became more deliberate. Statements were crafted. Silence was used strategically.
When attention grew uncomfortable, it was met with distance rather than engagement. The goal remained the same as it had always been: preserve the brand, minimize disruption. But the spotlight had a way of amplifying what silence tried to conceal. Personal struggles, once navigated privately, began to leak into public view. The pressure of expectation collided with the pressure of visibility. For some family members, the weight became difficult to manage. Fame, while alluring, also intensified scrutiny. Mistakes were noticed, choices were questioned. Behaviors that might have passed quietly in another family became symbols, interpreted and reinterpreted endlessly. This was especially challenging for those who had grown up without emotional outlets. Expressing distress publicly felt risky. Suppressing it entirely felt impossible. The result was often a quiet internal conflict played out under observation. The Hilton name became a projection screen. People filled it with assumptions, stories, and judgments. Few of them understood the family's internal culture, the decades of restraint that shaped behavior. But understanding was rarely part of the equation. Inside the family, tensions grew. Some felt that public attention threatened the legacy. Others felt it offered freedom. These differing perspectives created friction that was difficult to resolve. Conversations about boundaries, responsibility, and image became more frequent, but not necessarily more open. Once again, silence did much of the work. The empire itself continued to function smoothly. Hotels operated, investments performed. The business side of the legacy remained stable, but the emotional side grew more complicated. For the first time, the Hilton family had to confront something it had long avoided: vulnerability in public. There was no clear script for this. The family had been built on control and predictability. Fame thrived on unpredictability and emotion. Reconciling the two proved challenging. Some family members attempted to reclaim privacy by withdrawing. Others leaned into visibility, shaping their own narratives as best they could. Neither approach fully resolved the underlying tension. The brand could be managed, people could not. As the years passed, it became clear that the Hilton story was no longer just about hotels or inheritance. It was about identity, about how individuals raised to suppress emotion navigated a world that rewarded expression. The spotlight exposed contradictions that had always existed but were now impossible to ignore. Wealth without closeness, fame without grounding, legacy without clarity. This chapter of the story does not judge those choices, it simply observes them. The Hilton family did not seek fame in the modern sense. It arrived as a byproduct of history, wealth, and curiosity. But once it arrived, it changed everything. And as public attention intensified, the cost of maintaining a perfect image grew higher. The next phase of the story would reveal just how fragile that image could be when personal struggles collided with public expectation, and when the silence that once protected the family could no longer hold everything in. By the time the Hilton name became inseparable from public personality, the idea of a perfect image was no longer just a preference, it was an obligation. The family had spent decades mastering discretion, but now discretion had to operate in full view of the world. Every appearance, every comment, every absence was noticed, interpreted, and archived.
Luxury had always been part of the Hilton identity. Now it was also a performance. From the outside, the image was polished and enviable. Wealth, access, confidence, and ease. A life that seemed untouched by ordinary concerns. But maintaining that image required constant effort. There was little room for uncertainty, little tolerance for visible struggle. The Hilton name carried expectations that extended far beyond business. Inside the family, the pressure intensified. For generations, emotion had been something to manage quietly. Now, emotion, when it surfaced at all, did so under observation. The family's long-standing habit of silence collided with a culture that demanded explanation. The result was not openness, but strain. Public fascination rarely distinguishes between image and reality. It consumes symbols, not context. The Hilton name became a symbol of excess, privilege, and ease, even when individual family members felt anything but at ease. This disconnect was exhausting. Family members learned quickly that vulnerability, once public, could not be taken back. Every misstep became a headline. Every personal challenge was reframed as commentary. The safest option often seemed to say nothing at all. But silence in a loud world invites speculation. Attempts to protect privacy sometimes had the opposite effect. The less the family explained, the more others filled in the gaps. Narratives formed independently of facts. Assumptions hardened into stories. This placed individuals in an impossible position. Speak and risk being misunderstood. Stay silent and risk being defined by others. The cost of perfection grew heavier. Some family members tried to meet expectations by leaning fully into the image. They performed confidence even when they felt lost. They smiled through pressure. They treated attention as currency, something to be used rather than avoided. Others found the performance unbearable. The constant awareness of being watched amplified insecurities. Mistakes felt permanent. Ordinary growing pains became public spectacles. For those raised without emotional language, navigating this environment was particularly difficult. They had been taught to endure quietly, not to explain themselves. But endurance does not always translate well under scrutiny. The family's internal support structures were limited. Conversations about emotional well-being were rare. Seeking help felt like admitting weakness. And weakness in the Hilton worldview was something to be corrected, not discussed. This left many family members isolated, even while surrounded by attention. The image demanded confidence. The reality often felt fragile. At the same time, the business side of the empire continued to emphasize control. The brand could not appear unstable. Public confidence mattered. Any sign of internal turmoil risked affecting perception, and perception mattered deeply. So the family did what it had always done. It contained problems. It minimized exposure. It relied on professionals to manage fallout. Advisors, publicists, and legal teams became intermediaries between private reality and public image. This strategy worked to a point. But the more effort went into maintaining perfection, the more fragile that perfection became. Small cracks attracted outsized attention. The contrast between image and reality made every imperfection feel dramatic. For some, the pressure manifested as withdrawal. They reduced public appearances. They retreated from attention. Privacy became a form of self-preservation. For others, the pressure surfaced in more visible ways. Behaviors that might have been manageable in private life became magnified under observation. The family name amplified every action. This was not a failure of character. It was the consequence of an environment that offered little room for error and even less room for recovery. The Hilton family had mastered presentation, but presentation cannot replace support. Image cannot substitute for connection, and wealth cannot insulate indefinitely against emotional strain. As years passed, the contrast between the family's internal culture and external expectations became increasingly stark. The world expected authenticity. The family had been trained in restraint. The world rewarded vulnerability. The family valued composure. Neither approach was entirely wrong, but the gap between them was difficult to bridge. The idea of perfection, once a business asset, became a personal burden. Family members struggled to reconcile who they were with who they were expected to be. Identity blurred.
Self-worth became entangled with public reaction.
This chapter of the Hilton story is not about individual mistakes or specific moments. It's about atmosphere, about the slow accumulation of pressure that comes from living inside a carefully managed image. The hotels still promised comfort and calm. The brand still projected reliability. But behind that promise, the people carrying the name were navigating a world that offered little privacy and constant judgment. And as the story moves forward, the consequences of that pressure would become impossible to ignore. Because when perfection is demanded for too long, something eventually gives. And what breaks is rarely the image itself, but the people working hardest to protect it. By the time the Hilton family entered the modern era, the empire was no longer just a collection of hotels. It had become a symbol of luxury, of influence, and of expectation. The name carried weight that few families could imagine, and with that weight came scrutiny, pressure, and unspoken rules that shaped behavior in ways more subtle than any boardroom directive. The world outside was changing faster than any single person could manage. Media cycles accelerated, public curiosity intensified, and the Hilton name appeared in headlines not because of business achievements, but because of the family itself. Every wedding, every divorce, every vacation photographed by paparazzi became a small public event. For a family that had spent generations valuing discretion, this was both alien and uncomfortable. Inside the family, the long-standing culture of restraint collided with the demand for visibility. Members who had been trained to endure quietly now found themselves observed constantly. Actions that would have gone unnoticed in previous decades were now scrutinized. Silence, once a protective tool, became a liability. Not speaking opened the door to speculation, misinterpretation, and sometimes outright judgment. Some family members leaned into the attention, discovering an unexpected kind of freedom in public recognition. Being admired, photographed, and celebrated offered validation they had rarely received at home. They could exist outside the carefully controlled confines of family expectation and still command influence, albeit of a different kind. Others recoiled. The constant gaze magnified insecurities and emotional pressure that had been simmering quietly for years. Public life, even when glamorous, felt like an extension of the family system, always performing, always measured, always under judgment. The more visible they became, the more personal space shrank, and the more intense the struggle to maintain composure. This period also highlighted the generational divide. Older Hiltons, raised to respect hierarchy and protect the family image at all costs, struggled to understand younger members who navigated fame differently. Where silence and discretion were once safety, the younger generation saw opportunity. Where the older generation valued restraint, the younger generation craved connection and personal expression. The tension was subtle but persistent. Conversations about boundaries, responsibility, and image became more frequent, but they rarely achieved resolution. The family's long habit of avoiding direct confrontation persisted. Conflict was managed quietly, sometimes through withdrawal, sometimes through intermediaries, and sometimes through unspoken assumptions. Yet this visibility brought benefits as well. It created opportunities for independent identity and influence outside the hotel empire. Some Hiltons used fame to build personal brands, philanthropic initiatives, and careers that allowed them to assert individuality. They began to shape public narratives themselves rather than relying solely on the family's traditional channels of authority. Still, the pressure never fully dissipated. Public mistakes, even small ones, attracted outsized attention. The contrast between the carefully curated image and the reality of human imperfection was magnified. Every action became a potential reflection not just of the individual, but of the family legacy. This created a paradox.
Public recognition offered freedom, yet it also demanded adherence to a standard no one could entirely meet. The Hilton family, raised on decades of control and expectation, found that the very visibility they had once avoided now required constant vigilance. As this new era unfolded, the empire itself remained strong, financially stable, and globally influential. Hotels continued to operate with the precision and reliability that Conrad Hilton instilled decades earlier, but the human component, the relationships, the emotions, the subtle hierarchies, was more exposed than ever.
The collision of privacy and fame, of inherited discipline and modern expectation, the Hilton family had survived economic pressures, legal complexities, and the weight of a global brand. Now they faced a subtler challenge, surviving themselves in a world that demanded visibility, authenticity, and constant performance. And in the years that followed, the question would become impossible to ignore. Could a family built on control and silence adapt to a world that rewarded transparency and exposure? Or would the very pressures that had protected the Hilton empire for generations begin to unravel the people behind the name? Because the empire, sturdy as it seemed, was only part of the story. The human element, the relationships, loyalties, and unspoken expectations was far more fragile. And as the next generation took its place in the spotlight, the consequences of decades of restraint, discipline, and silence would finally come to bear. By the time the next generation of Hiltons fully stepped into public view, the empire was no longer just a symbol of luxury. It had become a stage. Every appearance, every statement, every relationship carried meaning beyond the personal. Wealth alone no longer defined the family. Visibility did. Attention became currency, and the cost of maintaining an image that had taken decades to perfect grew heavier with each passing year. The Hilton children and grandchildren, raised on decades of discipline, learned to navigate this pressure with varying degrees of grace. Some embraced it, seeing opportunity in fame and influence. Others struggled, finding the constant scrutiny exhausting and confining. In a family long trained to value control, composure, and silence, public life demanded qualities that had rarely been encouraged: vulnerability, accessibility, and relatability. The collision between inherited restraint and modern expectation produced tension both subtle and intense. Private disagreements that might have once been resolved quietly now played out under the lens of public observation. Personal struggles, even those entirely unrelated to the business, became fodder for speculation. Mistakes, when made, were magnified, not simply for what they were, but for what they revealed about the family dynamic. Yet, paradoxically, this visibility offered the younger Hiltons something Conrad Hilton could not: autonomy. Public recognition, media attention, and personal branding allowed individuals to define themselves outside the strictures of family expectation. It provided space to cultivate identity beyond inheritance, even if that space was fraught with risk. Navigating this new reality required careful balancing. Those who leaned too heavily into the spotlight risked criticism and misunderstanding. Those who avoided it entirely risked invisibility, exclusion, or the perception of failure. The family, built on precision and control, now faced an environment governed by perception, narrative, and the unpredictability of public opinion. Relationships, both within and outside the family, were affected. Friendships, romantic connections, and partnerships had to be managed with the knowledge that personal actions could reflect on the Hilton legacy. Privacy, once a shield, was no longer entirely possible. Discretion still mattered, but it was now layered atop a foundation of exposure, demanding constant vigilance. At the same time, the Hilton business empire remained strong. Hotels continued to operate globally with the efficiency and predictability established decades earlier.
Financial stability provided a sense of continuity, even as the human component, the relationships, expectations, and unspoken rules grew increasingly complex. The empire's outward success masked the quiet struggles that persisted behind the scenes. The evolution of public attention also brought generational contrasts into sharp relief. Older Hiltons, who had been raised to value restraint and discretion above all, sometimes struggled to understand the younger generation's approach to visibility. Younger members, accustomed to a world in which personality and media presence could drive opportunity, chafed against traditional expectations. The clash of values, while rarely explosive, produced subtle strains that shaped behavior, communication, and alliances. This period of transition highlighted a critical truth. The Hilton legacy was more than hotels, investments, or brand recognition. It was a system of behavior, a culture, a set of expectations about how to exist in the world. And while the empire itself was remarkably resilient, the people carrying the name had to navigate pressures that Conrad Hilton had never anticipated. Pressures born not of financial instability, but of visibility, expectation, and the weight of history. As the family moved into the modern era, the consequences of decades of discipline, silence, and control became impossible to ignore. Inheritance was no longer merely material, it was emotional, psychological, and deeply intertwined with identity. The tools that had protected the family for generations, silence, composure, and careful management of appearances, were now challenged by a world that rewarded openness, personality, and emotional expression. And so the Hilton story reached a turning point. The empire remained, powerful and unyielding, but the human element, the legacy of relationships, loyalties, and unspoken expectations was at a crossroads. How the family navigated this new reality would define not just the future of the brand, but the very meaning of being a Hilton in an age that could no longer ignore the complexity behind the name. Because in the end, luxury and visibility can survive nearly anything. What cannot always survive is the weight of a legacy carried without connection, empathy, or the freedom to simply be human. And that truth, more than any business decision, more than any hotel, was the final challenge the Hilton family would face. This marks the conclusion of their story of their rise, their inheritance, and the hidden pressures behind the glamorous name that millions recognize worldwide. The empire endures, but so do the lessons of restraint, control, and the quiet human costs that accompany even the greatest of fortunes. The full story of the Hilton family, from Conrad's disciplined beginnings to the modern-day pressures of visibility and legacy, is a portrait not just of wealth, but of the unseen forces that shape human experience behind every empire.